Good evening. So what has Hillhead got to tell us tonight? They're counting the votes there now, as you can see. It was a pretty good turnout, 76.36%. That's ever so slightly up on the general election. It's not a record for Scotland. They went over 80% in the Rutherglen by-election in 1964. But the faces smiling most broadly tonight are those of the Social Democrats, and that seems to be quite a good indication of how things are going. Labour is claiming that it has come second and says the Conservatives are third, and the Scottish National Party say, well, they're a little disappointed at the way things have gone. The Alliance have made one gain so far tonight in the local government elections. They've gained a seat from the Conservatives in Middlesbrough. But the Conservatives have held on in 6 other seats, including 2 in Beaconsfield, and that's where another by-election, a parliamentary by-election, is due. It may well be held, they say, on June the 3rd. Conservatives have held 2 seats there, though there's been a big rise in the Liberal vote. Conservatives have also held their seats in Plymouth, in Epping, in Tainbridge and in Norwich. And Labour have held one of their own seats in Middlesbrough. Well, while all this is going on and people are making up their minds about exactly how to react, we have here for the Conservatives Mr James Pryor, for the Scottish Nationalists, their parliamentary leader, Mr Donald Stewart, for the Social Democrat Liberal Alliance, Dr David Owen, and it is the SDP's first birthday tomorrow, which is now, of course, only 25 minutes away. And for Labour, the man who seems to have had the biggest meeting of all at Hillhead, Mr Tony Benn. At the count there now, Colin MacKay. Colin, how's it going?
Well, up here in Glasgow, Alastair, all the indications are, as you suggested earlier, that the SDP have every reason to look very happy indeed, because it does look as though they are going to take this seat in the by-election at Hillhead. And that the Conservatives, well, we're not sure. They could be trailing third behind Labour, which would be a disaster for them, because they've held this seat for 64 years. But the atmosphere here is very much the atmosphere of the intense concentration at this stage, where the votes are being separated and counted, where the candidates and their friends, their supporters, their counting agents are looking at the votes as they pile up and as they move forward. So the situation, as I say, SDP look as though they're going to win this seat. The Labour Party look as though they might well be second, with the Tories trailing at third. And then there's the question of the Scottish National Party, which is the 4th dimension in this 8-part contest. Because not only do you have Labour, Tory and SDP alliance, but in Scotland always this extra dimension of the Scottish National Party. For the last election in 1979, they got 10.1% of the vote. And the question now is, how much are they going to get? Are they going to be able to save their deposit well, or is there even a possibility that they might lose their deposit? It's early days. We're hoping for a declaration probably in about 40 minutes. Who knows, it might be slightly longer than that. And of course, there's always the possibility of recounts. But the atmosphere here is, as I say, very tense. And it looks as though the SDP, Liberal Alliance, are in fact, and I believe Mr Jenkins has actually come back into the hall. There he is, looking pretty intent. He's actually sitting in a room outside the hall, resting for a few moments after a very long and arduous campaign, during parts of which he must have felt that he was not going to get this seat, that maybe he was going to have another Warrington on his hands. A noble attempt, but it looks tonight as though for Mr Roy Harris Jenkins it is going to be a famous victory. That's how it looks at the moment. Peter.
Well, one thing about Hillhead, Colin, I'm sure you'll agree as a resident, is that it'll probably go down in history as one of the most polled places ever. A quarter of the voters, around 10,000 people, have been interviewed by the opinion polls as they search for clues about what's going to happen tonight. We can look at the main features of the Hillhead polls over the last month. 28 days ago, it was pretty well level pegging for the main parties, with the Conservatives just ahead. Then 13 days ago, it looked like disaster for the SDP alliance as they slumped to third, with Labour now in first place. 5 days ago, it was back to level pegging, with the SDP having a slight lead. 3 days ago, a boost for Labour, they shoot ahead. And yesterday, the eve of poll, the alliance bounces back with the biggest lead of all. But let's look at the SDP fortunes nationally, as told by the polls over a longer time frame. Starting with a reminder that there was once a time when no one thought there would be an SDP at all.
There's been a lot of talk about the possible formation of a new centre party. Some people have even been kind enough to suggest I might lead it. I find this idea profoundly unattractive.
But this is where the long road led, the launch of the SDP in March 1981. 13 Labour MPs and 1 Conservative deciding they'd had enough of the old setup and stepping out with Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams to put their political futures where their mouths were. This is what the Gallup opinion poll told them then, a year ago, that 30% of voters would vote Conservative at a general election, 34% would vote Labour, 18% Liberal and 14% for the newly born SDP. But 3 months later, the SDP and Liberals had arranged for the banns to be read. There was to be an alliance. So what was this in March became this in June. Conservative support, much the same, Labour 3.5% up, SDP and Liberals combined a shade less than their total separately. Next, Roy Jenkins lost at Warrington, but scored so highly he could claim a bigger victory.
What these figures mean, translated onto the national scene, is that we have a prospect of a social democratic liberal government with an overwhelming majority.
And David Steele, having got the Liberal Assembly to sign the alliance marriage certificate, was in no doubt it was the ticket to power.
Mr. President, I have the good fortune to be the first Liberal leader for over half a century who is able to say to you at the end of our annual assembly, go back to your constituencies and prepare for government.
The picture painted by the polls in June had now changed to this. No change for the Tories, but a 10% slump for Labour, and the Alliance leading the field for the first time with 40%. For the Alliance, though, it was to get even better. The new magic turned Bill Pitt, 3 times a Liberal loser at Croydon North West, into a champagne winner. And Shirley Williams returned to Parliament, sweeping away the mighty Conservative majority at Crosby.
It means that they're not only on our way, but we're very likely to form the next government of Great Britain.
The SDP tide was at the full. What was the pollsters' picture in October had by the year's end turned to this. More than half the electorate would vote either SDP or Liberal at a general election, enough to wipe out the other 2 parties altogether. But today, 3 months later, with Roy Jenkins fighting for his political life, December's heady heights have slumped to level pegging by the 3 main contenders at national level. And there were shocks at Hillhead when initial local polls showed the alliance trailing Conservatives and Labour for the first time.
Although that now seems to be turning out, if all the Strobe polls are right, into an alliance victory. We shall see in a moment when the real votes are counted. But, Mr. Pryor, whether you believe the polls or not, did you actually think the government could hold this seat?
I thought it would be very remarkable if we did, and I think that to have pulled up so well in the last few months, as we undoubtedly have, to be in a position of holding this seat is a very remarkable performance. And in the middle of a very difficult Parliament, 3 years into this Parliament now, I think that it's really quite remarkable that we're in such a good position.
Still, you've held this seat since 1918. It has
well,
now gone.
we've been holding it with very much reduced majorities in the last few years, and Scotland has not been a happy place for us. And I think we've had a very outstanding candidate in Jerry Malone, and I'm very happy with all that's happened in Hillhead the last few weeks.
Mr. Benn, The Labour Party hasn't won a seat from the Conservatives at a by-election since 1971, over 10 years. Why?
Well, it certainly wouldn't win Hillhead on that basis because the sort of normal majority in Hillhead is about 10,000. And for 64 years it's been a Tory seat. I think also if you do have 5 or 6 former Labour cabinet ministers who 12 months ago tonight were members of the Labour Party going and devoting most of their time to trying to destroy the party that put them where they were, that's unsettling. It would be a major event if Labour won. It's been well organised and its morale is high. But can I put to you what I think is the real benchmark here? And that is a comparison between the figures we shall hear tonight and the figures in February 1974. And I give you what they were. If Labour gets more than 24% of the vote and more than 7,997 votes, that was when you had a Tory majority of 6,000 and a Labour government. And I think the second thing that's interesting is to look and see where the SDP vote comes from, because I would expect most of it came from the Conservatives because the policies on the common market and nuclear weapons and the monetarism and so on are very similar. So I would expect tonight, if it is true what's been forecast, that most of the SDP support would come from the Conservatives, which seems to me quite appropriate given the similarity of their policies.
You prefer the February figures to the October figures in the 1974
Well, the point about
elections.
the February figures is that that was when Jeremy Thorpe was at the peak. And the truth is that if the SDP does grow, and in fact its support is falling pretty sharply, as the polls showed, but if it reaches any sort of a peak, it will eat into the Tory vote and might let Labour in. That's not how I'd like to win the election, but it could well be the consequence that Tories will vote for the SDP as, quite properly, a second Conservative party.
Dr. Owen, Mr. Jenkins seemed to be in trouble at one time in this by-election. Why do you think he's winning now?
I think it takes time to get our message across. We're still, as you say, only just a year old, and I think it's found in all the campaigning that we need time to explain and time to get across. In this particular situation, I think that Roy was encountering resistance, not so much because he was not a Scot, but because they wanted to be sure that he would take Hillhead seriously. As they saw him take Hillhead seriously, as he campaigned very effectively, I think they began to trust him and began to think that this was the right way to vote. But let's see the result. I don't count my chickens yet.
But what about Mr. Benn's point, that you can fight seats like this because all of you go there and work hard there? At a general election, you couldn't do that.
Well, I mean, the same thing applies to the Labour Party. They packed it up with members of the shadow cabinet. The same thing happened to the Conservative. They sent all their ministers up there, everybody except for Mrs. Thatcher. So I don't think this, in a by-election, every party concentrates its appeal, sends up all its people. So that that's not the case. And I think when you look at the breakdown of the vote, that Tony Benn will find that a very surprisingly high number of Labour voters have voted. And, of course, it's absolute nonsense. We do not hold the same policies as the Conservative Party on nuclear weapons. We're, for example, opposed to the Trident missile system, and we do not hold the same policies on them as monetarism. I think the interesting thing will be to see how many Labour voters actually vote for us. I think you'll find a very large number do.
Well, we may have a chance to test some of these ideas just in a moment. But, Mr. Stewart, your man was claiming at one time, or your people were claiming at one time, you might get 20% of the vote. You don't hope for that now?
No, I don't think we will. But, of course, it was never very good ground for us. In fact, it's more of a British constituency than a Scottish one. It's the only one that has kept to the Unionist Tory party in the whole of Glasgow. So we started from a very low base. We had an excellent candidate. Couldn't have been better, but it was a very great uphill struggle for us.
It's been said that Mr. Leslie actually was dragging the Scottish National Party back from extinction. Now, if he fails to save his deposit tonight, that could mean you are back on the brink again.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I don't think it was as bad as that. But I think what he's done is he's revived the morale of the Scottish National Party. We've had a lot of support from young people, and it was that put us on our way before. And I think that the other English parties will find a great deal of trouble because of the support that the young people have given us in this election.
Well, gentlemen, we've had your words before the result. We'll be back to you very shortly. Those of us who've actually lived in Hillhead for most of our lives have watched with great admiration the efforts of journalists from London and even from as far away as Edinburgh trying to find some rhyme or reason in the old place. What follows now is just a local boy's impression. Much of Hillhead is posh, much isn't. The constituency contains nothing of the old borough of Hillhead, which the Victorian middle class defiantly set up to stop the western march of Glasgow. But now here in genteel Kelvinside, in the heart of the constituency, the middle classes have been making up their minds about whether or not they want to stop the onward march of Mr. Roy Jenkins and his Social Democrats. Tory Kelvinside, with its neo-Georgian and Greek revival terraces and churches, was built on the wealth of what was once the second city of the empire. Now it harbours an elderly population living on its memories, interspersed with the young, often radicalised professional classes, university teachers, doctors, nurses, in the bourgeois barracks of red sandstone, the flats of Hindland. Some work at the Scottish bureaucracy of the BBC. The Thatcherite families have their local private hospital, their famous private schools, and the fields that occasionally give Scottish rugby an international player. Its man is young Mr. Jerry Malone, a Roman Catholic, who's been defending majority of just 2,000. He's had a defence problem.
The most difficult one that we had to deal with was one that came up quite early on in the campaign, which was the Trident issue, because it's very easy to present the emotional case against it, and we had to be careful that we were able to point to all the detailed arguments in favour of the deterrent and the slightly limited cost that it is going to make in the defence budget.
To the south, in Partick, increasingly given over to the motorway and dereliction, the Tories usually hold on in a good year. There are relics of a spacious past, like the old West of Scotland cricket ground. Elsewhere, pennies matter. Here, among the cut-price shops and the net-lace curtains of the Crow Road and Balshagray Road, where life is leaner and doubts are bigger, the newer, smaller parties have had their main chance. Though Mr. Roy Jenkins, philosopher and midwife of change, has found history hard to beat.
Here, perhaps more than in most other constituencies I've experienced, the geographical and the class division is fairly rigid, that people here are somewhat hardened into voting Conservative in one part of the constituency and Labour in the other part of the constituency, and not intermingling very much.
The Scottish nationalist Mr. George Leslie has made headway in a seat where the SNP got just 10% last time. He's done especially well attacking Labour.
Because we've already got so many Labour MPs in Scotland. I mean, Scotland should be a Labour-run country, but of course they're much happier to be run by Mrs Thatcher than they are to make sure that Labour policies are put into practice in Scotland. And I believe, in fact, another Labour MP will be lost in the back benches of Westminster.
Scotstoun, with its raddle-ruined old tenements and glum council rows, is Labour country. Yarrow's shipyard is prosperous, and is prosperous on defence contracts. But Labour's Mr. David Wiseman, always attended by a minder, is a convinced disarmer.
We've seen within the past couple of years a real revival in the movement in relation to peace and nuclear disarmament. The campaign for nuclear disarmament has had an increasing membership, and obviously it's extremely relevant to an area within the west of Scotland, which is perhaps one of the major targets for any nuclear attack that would take place.
For generations in Hillhead, the Tories up the hill have whacked Labour down the hill. Tonight they both want to keep the new parties, the upstarts, down and out. But will they? Well, now a word from the voters of Hillhead themselves. And I've been told tonight that they are absolutely fed up with parties, with being canvassed and being polled by every opinion poll within sight. And, of course, they've had the extra problem on their ballot paper today of the real Roy Jenkins, as we might call him, and another Roy Jenkins who changed his name specially by deed poll to be beastly to the real Roy Jenkins. Funny enough, no one has asked me my view about how I voted in Hillhead, but David Walter spoke to a number of people who actually came out from the polling stations today, and I should add hastily that this is not a straw poll, and it is not actually our idea of how the count will come out.
Of the voters we asked, the most said they'd gone for Roy Jenkins, while the SDP tried to make sure they'd voted for the right Roy Jenkins.
Roy Jenkins.
How did you vote in the past?
Conservative.
Why have you switched this time?
I prefer him as a candidate to Malone?
Like a change. It's my protest against Thatcher, I think.
I like the man, so that's all there is to it.
Yes, I voted for Mr Jenkins.
How have you voted in the past?
I voted Liberal in the last election, Labour before that.
The switches aren't all the SDP's way.
I'm telling you, Scottish nationalists.
You've always been Scottish nationalist?
No, I've been a Tory. We both have been all our lives.
Why did you go for the SNP instead of Roy Jenkins?
I think it's for Scotland. I don't think Roy Jenkins can do much good for us.
But there were many staying loyal to the two main parties.
I voted for the Conservative Party, I must admit.
Always have done, yes.
Did you consider Roy Jenkins?
Not at all.
Why not?
Well, I don't feel he's really right for Hindman. I think, for this constituency, yes, I think we'd better have a Scot.
So you voted for Mr Malone mainly because of Trident?
No, not just because of Trident, because I still think the Social Democrats are too leftist.
There were Labour voters too, with little time for Mr Jenkins. Did you consider Roy Jenkins?
Never.
Why not?
In 1,000 years, never.
Why not?
The carpetbagger.
Well, I don't know much about him, but what does he know about us?
Would you mind telling us how you voted?
Oh, no, it's a secret.
A secret, fair enough.
Well, it's no secret now that Colin MacKay is in Glasgow with the Conservative, Mr Jerry Malone.
Jerry Malone, have you won?
Well, Colin, I've had a good look around the room, and it would appear that certainly we haven't won. It rather looks as if Mr Jenkins has won.
Would you place yourself second, third?
I just don't know at this stage. It's very difficult looking at the papers as they pile up. I wouldn't like to make that sort of decision.
Can I ask you then why you think that the Conservatives, who've held this seat for 64 years, since its creation in 1918, have done so badly tonight?
Well, let's get it in its context. We have lost elections in the Conservative Party very recently with majorities of 19,000 or so. I would look upon this, and particularly the position that we maintained in the polls, as showing that we were beginning to get our economic policies through. We had a good budget in this campaign, followed by interest rates coming down. That certainly helped, and I think it helped to keep our position up. But my view of the matter is that we're going to have a little bit longer lead-in before this really takes the minds of the electorate.
Could I ask you this question, Mr Malone? Many people saw you as an ideal candidate for the constituency, tailor-made in the sense that they said because you were local, that you were young, you knew Glasgow, you were fond of Glasgow, and all that sort of thing. What do you think, really, you would have had to have done to win here? Because the vote does appear to have fallen away very suddenly at the end.
I tell you what really worried me was when I saw a photograph of Mr Jenkins walking around the pond, outside the Pond Hotel, and I thought, well, here we are in a by-election where people can afford the luxury of keeping perhaps an elder statesman in politics. And I think that's exactly what they've done. By-elections are a luxury for a lot of people, and I think they've taken that soft option.
Would you be hoping to back again at the general election?
Not a matter for me to decide. The association has to decide that. Anything I say would prejudice their independence. I wouldn't do that.
Jerry Malone, the Conservative candidate, thank you very much. And now over to Peter.
Well, with me back in the counting room is the Labour candidate, 34-year-old community worker David Wiseman. David Wiseman, you heard what Jerry Malone said. He's conceded defeat. Do you?
Well, I think it's certainly shown that Mr Jenkins has got a large vote here, but the Labour vote appears to have held up very well indeed, and we're very pleased at that.
When you say the Labour vote has held up, you're saying it's held up bigger than Mr Jenkins's vote?
Well, we think that, in fact, Mr Jenkins has probably got it, but we're saying that the Labour vote has held up very well, and we believe certainly that we've got second place in this.
Why do you think Mr Jenkins has got it?
Well, I think, people are going to be confused by the fact that there are policies given by an individual, and they are not sure yet whether the policies are actually adopted by that particular party or not, and people will be refused by that. I think also there is a factor that a lot of the publicity has gone to Mr Jenkins, and even tonight, there was a front-page picture of Mr Jenkins that went out, and no one of the other candidates were shown at all in terms of the front page, those sort of influence.
If the figures do bear out Jenkins' victory, it gives the lie to the carpetbagger image, doesn't it? People don't think they're being used in Hillhead.
Well, some people certainly do, because some people certainly didn't, and I believe earlier tonight there were people that were commenting on that. I think what's got to be is the testing of the position. We'll find out now whether Mr Jenkins will be a good constituency MP for Hillhead.
How many times a year or a month would you expect to see him in Hillhead?
I don't know. I mean, Mr Jenkins will show that.
And what sort of campaign has it been for you? Are you worn out now?
Oh, it's a tiring campaign, a long campaign, but a very enjoyable campaign. I've enjoyed it very much indeed. And, of course, there's always the general election, don't forget that.
You'll be back then?
Oh, yes.
Alastair.
Well, Peter, before you go, I'd like to put a point to you. Just about 2 weeks ago, Mr. Jenkins looked as if he was finished. People were saying that, newspaper headlines said that, the opinion polls said that. What do you think has turned it round? I mean, is this like Crosby, just a follow-on?
I think when one looks with hindsight at the Jenkins campaign, it was perfectly timed. I think if you look at the Shirley Williams campaign in Crosby, it was perfectly timed. There was no pre-peaking. I think if you look here at Hillhead, the Labour Party peaked probably around about the time of Tony Benn's ecstatically received meeting last week. I think the Conservative candidate will probably admit that he peaked sometime last week. But Jenkins, as the polls indicated, built steadily, and in the last few days there was a sudden surge of support, probably fuelled by the polls themselves, Alastair. Bob Worcester of Murray points out that 8% of Jenkins's vote admits that they were influenced by the polls, whereas 4% of people who said they voted for other people said they were influenced by the polls. So, proportionately, twice the number of SDP voters joined this sort of bandwagon effect. They seem very prone to that.
And, Peter, you think that bandwagon effect mattered perhaps as much in keeping other candidates out as in electing Mr. Jenkins?
Yes. At the very beginning of the campaign, when I was here, I made a point of trailing around behind Mr. Jenkins as he went around the shopping centre and tapping old ladies on the shoulder and saying, "What did you think of him?" And one of them said, "He's not for us, he's using us." And that seemed to be the strongest card that Mr. Jenkins' opponents had. And as I just put to Mr. Wiseman, it didn't stick. He actually did get round more voters than the other candidates. Again, I can show you the Murray figures, which I think a bit of research has gone into. 9% of electors in Hillhead met Mr. Wiseman, 12% met Mr. Malone, but 18% met Mr. Jenkins. And the label which they tried, Mr. Leslie, the SNP candidate for one, tried to put on him as the man who wouldn't come out, wouldn't canvass, wouldn't fight, wouldn't mix it, has actually shown himself to be a very, very astute campaigner. I think the campaign he conducted at Warrington will bear out, with hindsight, that Roy Jenkins is a formidable political campaigner. He's a man of steel during these elections. You may not agree with his opinions, his views, but I should think there'll be trepidation among his opponents in future.
Peter, we'll come back. Thank you. There'll be plenty of time, I think. We're still waiting first for the result, and of course we're also waiting for Roy, who's a little bit coy. I think he knows he's won all right, but he's going to stage manage, as is his right, his appearance to give his words then. Mr. Benn, is it untrue to say that the old Labour Party, the Labour Party of Attlee and Gaitskell, and indeed some years with Sir Harold Wilson, have won this by-election?
No, I think what people... I mean, assuming that the...
Assuming.
Right. And may I just make one point? This other Jenkins changed his name by deed poll. Roy Jenkins changed his party allegiance by deed poll, and of the two, I must say, I think the second is less desirable. But Hillhead being a Tory seat, they have voted for three policies, which are Conservative policies: to remain in the common market, to keep the American Polaris in Holy Lock, whatever the argument about the Trident may be, and for an anti-trade union candidate, because the SDP voted for the Tebbit bill, and for monetarist policies. So I don't see any resemblance, frankly, between the SDP and the old Labour Party. I think they're much more like Reg Prentice. Only Reg Prentice began in a Labour cabinet and ended up as a Tory backbencher. I think Roy Jenkins is going, you remember the old song, The Day I Went to Birmingham, by way of Beachy Head. I think Roy Jenkins will end up in a coalition with the Conservative Party, but he's doing it in the way in which he's doing it. And I don't see any resemblance between the old Labour Party and this view at all. Indeed, when I canvassed in the 1935 election, we had a manifesto much more left-wing than Mr. Callaghan gave us in 1979.
Well, Mr. Pryor, do you accept Mr. Jenkins as a Conservative?
No, I don't accept him as a Conservative, but I'm absolutely amazed by Tony Benn. Here he is criticising Roy Jenkins for voting for or being in a cabinet which was in favour of Polaris and still is in favour of Polaris, as I understand it, although I think that it's now outdated myself. But Tony Benn was in that same cabinet. He voted. He was in favour of Polaris, presumably when he was in the cabinet. Otherwise, he would have had to have left the cabinet. So I really don't think he's got any right to start throwing stones at Roy Jenkins in this way. I think actually that Tony Benn has changed his policies a good deal more than Roy Jenkins has over the last couple of years or so, and that probably accounts for the Labour Party putting up such a bad performance at Hillhead and nearly everywhere else. Now, I think that a lot of the support which has gone to Roy Jenkins from the Conservative Party will come back to the Conservative Party at a general election. But I think that the Labour Party have a much more long-term serious problem. If they can't win a constituency like this in a by-election, then they're in dread trouble.
Dr. Owen, Mr. Benn has actually said in the past that he thinks the SDP are, I may be saying it incorrectly, but a middle-class right-wing alternative to the Conservative Party for which people are likely to vote now the Conservative Party is in trouble. What's your answer to that?
Well, it's rubbish. He knows it perfectly well. I mean, you've only got to
But haven't you taken your votes from the Conservatives in Hillhead?
No, look at Warrington. We took our votes from the Labour Party. That was a Labour solid, safe seat. And Roy Jenkins, we were told all these things, actually often by Tony Benn, that he was wouldn't go down at all well, wouldn't take votes. We did take those votes. We've taken Labour votes in many parts of the country, and we've done so again in Hillhead. The only question, we don't now know exactly how many, but I would suspect a very substantial sum. I mean, you look at the by-elections that have been held up and down the country. There was one in Plymouth tonight. We slashed into the Labour vote. Now, this is happening all over the country. And what I think Tony Benn fails to understand is the disillusionment amongst many Labour voters of all the policies that he now espouses. And they are very different. Jim Pryor's quite right. Tony was in a cabinet which gave a referendum to the people on the European community. He told us he was going to accept the verdict of the people. No sooner was the ink dry on that referendum than he was effectively disowning the verdict of the people. And he stayed in throughout, while we were in the European community, throughout the time we had Polaris weapons. He discovers this great crusade against nuclear deterrence only when he loses elections, when he goes into opposition. And it's nonsense to say that we're monetarists. We've been advocating in Hillhead policies to reduce unemployment by 1 million in the first 2 years and hopefully take it down by 2 million in the lifetime of a Parliament. Now, those are very different policies from those being espoused by Mrs. Thatcher, and he knows it.
Mr. Benn?
Well, I think really what's happened is that under Ted Heath and under Harold Wilson, in a way, we had SDP policies. And I think that's broadly true. I think what David Owen says is correct. But the fact is that the Labour Party has come out after a lot of discussion with policies that are, as far as one can make out, supported by the majority of the British public. This is the point I'd like to make at this stage. If you look at public opinion polls, I think the BBC itself said 60% want to leave the common market completely, as I do, and I did in 75. And that is a majority national view and the Labour Party view. The overwhelming majority think unemployment is a major issue. And, of course, as far as monetarism is concerned, it was the Jenkins budget of 1970 which produced the mass unemployment in January 71 that Ted Heath had to deal with. And on the question of the Polaris, the Labour Party has come out for a non-nuclear strategy. All I would say about that is that CND is about 4 times as big as the SDP. And it's always struck me as very strange that the growth of the nuclear disarmament movement, including a lot of Conservatives and Liberals, should get so little attention compared to the SDP, which I think has passed its peak. So that we shall see. But my own guess is that whatever the figures are tonight, and we'll have to look very carefully, it may be that the SDP has passed its peak. And I think that is probably likely to be the case.
Have a word with Mr. Stewart, I think, because we've been discussing what I think might be called Great Britain or United Kingdom issues now. And Mr. Stewart, the question of the American nuclear base, indeed the British nuclear base in the Clyde, has seemed to be quite a major one in the Hillhead by-election, yet it appears that your man wasn't able to exploit it sufficiently to make a real inroad.
Well, I think it was a major issue, and I think this is going to be a message to the Conservative government about it. The SNP has had a consistent anti-nuclear policy for a very long time, and like the Labour Party, which made noises against armaments, were at the same time carrying on secretly with shovelling and things of that kind. So their record isn't all that clean on it. And even in this by-election, Jenkins went the length of saying he would stop Trident provided it hadn't gone on. So there was a good deal of support for the idea that the Trident mustn't come to Scotland if it has to come to the UK at all.
Now, are you going to stop a NATO base at Stornoway?
Well, I hope to, and we're certainly keeping on the pressure towards that, because the whole of the west of Scotland is being used as a dumping ground for all these dangerous installations, and the people of Scotland are saying that this must now come to an end.
I see some SNP banners, actually, at the Hillhead count. Let's go there and hear what's happening.
Well, there seems to be a demonstration outside the hall with a lot of SNP banners. It's a tremendous noise, which we can actually hear in the hall as well. It's just a fantastic demonstration by the Scottish National Party, and it's the sort of demonstration we have seen before by the SNP. But on this particular occasion, they may find that the vote for their party isn't as high as they want. But it is interesting to see this very large demonstration of support for the SNP. And as I say, the deafening noise, which we can actually also hear inside the hall at Knightswood, just at the Hillhead count. In fact, we expect a declaration here somewhere around 25 minutes' time. If my watch is right, then that would mean about 12:30. Round about 12:30, we can expect a declaration here. So these people that you can see, Alastair, out there with their banners, the Lion Rampant, the Leslie placards, the Saltire Cross of Scotland, of St Andrew, they'll know the result by then, as we'll be telling you. And now back to Alastair in London.
As Colin was saying, the result expected about 12:30, which is about par for the course on by-elections. And going back now to Mr Stewart. See, that's a demonstration there going on outside the counting school where the count is taking place, Mr Stewart. But it's so different from the great days when you had the Hamilton by-election or the Govan by-election, when you were picking up seats. What's gone wrong with your party?
Well, on this occasion, of course, we've been squeezed out. There's been a lot of media attention on Roy Jenkins, and it was a Conservative seat, and the Labour Party always had a base there. It was never good for us, so we started from a very poor base there. And I'd be quite interested to see what Mr Leslie has done. But there are other seats in Scotland where, if a by-election offers, I can almost guarantee that we'll be very much back again in the picture.
All right, we'll have you back again on the seat of your choice. But Mr Pryor, what has cooked the Conservative goose? Is it 3 million unemployed? Is it a budget which really didn't turn out to be as popular as it first seemed? Is it the nuclear weapons issue? What is your basic problem?
I don't think anything's cooked the Conservative goose. I think we've done pretty well. I think, as I said once before, that 3 years into a parliament and with a world economic position as bad as it is, for us to be in the running in a seat of that nature is an extremely good result. And so I think that we stick to our policies. Unemployment is very serious, but there are signs now that we're over the worst. If you look at the figures in Germany, for example, they're going up far more sharply now than our figures are. And so I believe that we're going to come out of this recession fit and able to advance. There's a Bank of England report only tonight, which is far more optimistic in terms of the situation of the economy now than it has been for a number of years. So for all these reasons, I think we're still going through a difficult period. We've got to get some more things behind us before we show the real advantages which are going to come to this country.
Yes, but it could be said that you actually had a fall in the unemployment figures, however brought about, in the course of this week before the by-election. It could be said that you would actually put forward money to build an exhibition centre in Glasgow on the verge of this constituency. It could be said that the Prime Minister has had Hillhead in so many of her thoughts as well as her speeches over the past 2 weeks. There was a time when you thought you were going to hold this seat. So what's gone wrong?
Well, I think that had we held this seat, it would have been an even more remarkable result. And I don't think anything has gone wrong at all. I think perhaps that the Trident issue is a more difficult issue in a by-election than it is in a general election. Of course, what is always so significant about defence is that governments or opposition parties tend to try to make the running against nuclear weapons and so on. But when they have the responsibilities for government, they take a different view. And that, of course, has characterised the Labour Party in opposition over a number of years. And when they get back into government, they have always found themselves keeping the weapon and, in fact, updating the weapon. And I feel that the same thing would happen with Roy Jenkins with Trident, I'm certain that he would find that Trident was much better value for money in the terms of having to find a new nuclear deterrent over the next 15 to 20 years, and that he would certainly be in favour of it were he to be in government. Now, I don't know where the Labour Party would be. Always before, they have fought in opposition on an anti-nuclear ticket, and once they've got back into government, they've carried on with nuclear weapons. So, and again, you see, I can't but come back to this. When Tony Benn says that the country is behind Labour policies, the extraordinary thing is that if the country is behind Labour policies, why on earth don't they vote for the Labour Party? And they're not voting for the Labour Party. And it's quite remarkable. He mentioned the common market, he mentioned nuclear weapons, he mentioned unemployment and so on. Here we have a number of problems, but the electorate refuse, when it comes to a by-election, and even now in local elections as well, to vote for the Labour Party. As far as Roy Jenkins is concerned, I think he's now going to be put under the microscope. I don't believe that the Social Democrats have been put under the microscope yet, but I think when Roy comes into the House now, which I presume he's going to do, I think you'll find that his policies and the policies of the Social Democrats will come into a lot more careful examination than they've done so far, particularly that last policy, which is 2 million off the unemployed in a lifetime for Parliament. I think it would be marvellous if it could be done, and we shall do it if we can. But I don't believe I've seen any policies yet from the Social Democrats that justify them.
Well, Dr. Owen, is he your new parliamentary leader?
Well, he's certainly, in my view, going to be the leader of the Alliance and our Prime Minister designate. I think the question of the parliamentary leader, that's an issue we've still got to decide, the method of election and also possibly hold an election. So I think that's down the track, but I personally think he's shown in this campaign that he is the natural person to weld together the two distinct parties, the Liberal Party and the Social Democratic Party, and I've always made it clear that I think he is very likely to be the next Prime Minister. I think, as far as Jim Pryor is concerned, I agree with him. I think to take unemployment down by 2 million will be massively difficult. I think we ought to attempt it. I think the first million you can do. I think the interesting thing is the electorate's sense that the way we're approaching reducing unemployment is credible. I think they think the Labour Party's policies are incredible. The interesting thing about Tony Benn is he simply doesn't seem to be able to face up to the fact that the Labour Party is losing support and is not able to retain support. And I think it is worth asking why is this, because, as he says, they're opposing some policies which are superficially popular. Even on the common market, when it really comes to the crunch, when people have to face what are the implications of leaving, when they face what is going to be the implications for the factories in their towns, in their cities, and for jobs, I think they'll vote, were they to be given the chance, which the Labour Party don't seem to even be prepared to let them, the same as they did in 75, probably not so overwhelmingly. But I think there is a sort of trust problem now for the Labour Party. They say these things and people don't believe them. They say all this on nuclear policy. They don't believe them. I'll just say this. When I was Foreign Secretary, I opposed Trident in government. I've opposed it in government as well as out of government. And it's been the consistent view of the Social Democrats ever since the first debate over a year ago that we would oppose Trident.
Mr. Benn, they seem to be talking about you.
Well, I think it's true there's been a credibility problem. And I think the credibility problem, in part, has been that there have been so many people in the past in the leadership of the general leadership of the Parliamentary Party who really were out of sympathy with the Labour Party all along. And I don't think it all began in the last couple of years. I was just jotting down. We lost Taverne, George Brown, a deputy leader, Mayhew, Gunter, Shawcross, Marsh, and so on. Now we've lost Jenkins, Owen, Williams, Rogers, and 20 others sitting in Parliament under false pretences because they've never exposed themselves to the electorate. And frankly,
Mrs. Williams has...
Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry, that's absolutely right. She and Roy Jenkins are the only two SDP MPs. I suppose Bill Pitt for Croydon could claim that he's a Liberal who got in under the Alliance ticket. But I think that to sit in Parliament under false colours is itself wrong. But all I would say is this. I think people underestimate what is happening. President Reagan is behaving in an irresponsible and a dangerous way. His missiles are here and can be used without the consent of the British House of Commons or government. And I think anyone who underestimates the strength of the peace movement, or for that matter, anyone who underestimates Michael Foot's commitment to have a non-nuclear defence strategy is misunderstanding the strength of his feeling. And I similarly think that the SDP policy allegedly for getting unemployment down is just the first half of the old stop-go, or rather it's the go-stop, and try it, and then immediately the IMF will come and stop them, because all these SDP ministers ran a mile in 1976 in the cabinet when the IMF told them to stop it. And I don't think it's a serious proposal. Now, on the common market, you know, really people do know now from experience, very expensive. It'll cost us 622 million in taxation this year, makes our food expensive, and we lose the right to govern ourselves. So, all right, I don't... obviously, other people are going to put a view favourable to them, but I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the way in which public opinion is coalescing around what really are the policies of the Labour Party. And I believe the SDP has now passed its peak.
And yet, Mr. Benn, in a seat where you were only 2,000 votes short in the general election of 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher was at her peak, you failed to pick up the seat tonight, so far as we can tell.
Well, I don't know. We don't know precisely. But all I would say, I go back to what I said at the beginning. In February 1974, let me just give you the figures again, when the Tories had a majority of 6,000, we only had just under 8,000, and just under a quarter of the vote, there was a Labour government. And I believe the SDP is going to do what Jeremy Thorpe did, and allegedly, Roy Jenkins asked to join the Liberal Party in 1979. Pardo said he did. I think what we're witnessing is Jeremy Thorpe reappearing in the guise of Roy Jenkins, and I think he'll take more Tory votes than Labour votes. And so I don't regard a Jenkins premiership as being on the cards. But there's a lot more to go before the election comes.
Well, we have a little time to go before we hear from the returning officer, and we'll come back about what's alleged and what's not alleged. But I think plainly for many people the chief interest in the Hillhead by-election has been the return of Roy Jenkins, or his attempt to get back into the House of Commons at the ripe old age of 61, which I think only possibly Mr. Stewart here is now actually looking in the face, and the future of the SDP and Liberal Alliance. But before we actually get the result of the vote, we did do a little exercise. Just suppose the Social Democrat wasn't going to win. What would that mean? Well, Peter Sissons asked 3 commentators. Would that be the be-all and the end-all? The 3 commentators were Mr. David Butler, who of course is the doyen of commentators, Mr. John Hanvey of the Opinion Research Centre, and he spoke first to Mr. Bob Worcester of Morey.
I don't think that the SDP can be written off on the basis of one by-election. It will be a staggering blow to them, no question about it, and it will erode Mr. Jenkins' possibility of being the leader of the party, and he's certainly the strongest potential leader of that party. Although, as a matter of fact, our polls show that a majority of SDP Liberal Alliance supporters would prefer David Steele.
I think the SDP hasn't slumped as much as some people suggest. Nonetheless, easy come, easy go. It was growing in very shallow soil. People weren't voting for the SDP or the SDP Liberal Alliance because it stood for something. They were voting for it because it was not Labour and wasn't Conservative. I think the strength of the centre does depend on the repulsiveness of the right and left.
A lot of British politics is about impressions. It's not about policies. It's impressions, themes, broad ideas. And I think that they have established a position for themselves as a centre block in British politics. But I don't really think that people have very much idea about the policies for which they're standing. Certainly there must be an element of protest vote in the percentages of voting intention they're picking up.
What do you feel in your bones is going to happen at the next election, general election?
I would guess that if the Conservatives can teach the public to think in terms of 3 million and falling in terms of unemployment, and single-digit inflation, and break through the 10-point barrier, so that they appear to be getting it right but need time to make solid their position, coupled with, at the same time, a Roy Jenkins in the leadership and a credible alternative among the Social Democratic Party Liberal Alliance, coupled yet again with a continuing Labour Party in chaos, then I suspect that there will be a narrow Conservative victory, possibly with the balance of power held by the Social Democratic Party Liberal alliance.
I don't think it can disappear completely. The upsurge of the centre in the last year has been greater than any past upsurge for the Liberal Party, and I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think the Conservative and Labour parties are going to recapture the centre, at any rate at all, completely. Therefore, I'm sure that we shall have a substantial alliance presence in the next Parliament.
For the first time, a third force in British politics has people at its head of established national reputation. That has never happened before. Another thing which has never happened before is that they have maintained this strong position in the polls over a very long period. That has never happened before. So I think really what I'm saying is that it would be a very foolish person who at this stage would predict what's going to happen over the next 12 months in the voting intentions for any of the parties.
Well, no doubt we'll hear a lot more from them about how all their polls were right, although perhaps the Gallup poll may have something to answer for tomorrow morning. Anyway, at the count, it seems to me that Peter Sissons is standing there, and all he's got to do is to talk to the young ladies who were counting the votes. Peter, what's happened now?
I'm having a little difficulty hearing you, Alastair, because of the noise coming in from that demonstration outside. But let me give you a quick update. These marvellous boys and girls, most of whom seem to work at various Scottish banks, have finished the counting. They've been counting the votes as if they were doing used £5 notes. Anyway, the votes are now on the bottom table. We mustn't get too close to them, of course, otherwise we'll be in trouble. The candidates' agents are looking at them, verifying them, making sure there isn't going to be a recount, or who knows, there may be a recount, perhaps at the lower end of the scale, if say, a deposit were in danger and there was only a small margin in it. But I would guess that within the next 5 or 10 minutes we will have a declaration, and we'll know that, of course, by the great rush into the hall of the Fleet Street and International photographers who are all penned up outside, but the returning officer, Mr. Calderwood, who's the chief executive of Strathclyde Regional Council, will let them in, and that'll be the signal for the moment that we've been building up to.
Well, Peter, I'm sure we look forward to Mr. Calderwood's big moment. I never heard of a Scottish bank clerk, I don't wish to cast any aspersions on their professional capability, who counted used £5 notes as quickly as Peter was suggesting. However, we'll wait and see. I'm told that if you actually want to curry favour with the Social Democrats at their headquarters in Glasgow, please rush a television set to them. I'm told that 300 of them are really very angry and annoyed now. They can't find a television set that works, and they're going to miss the big moment. Well, now, Dr. Owen, it will be a big moment for Mr. Jenkins, coming back at the age of 61, coming back as his great exemplar, Asquith, did in the early 1920s. But Mr. Asquith was a flash in the pan. He won a great by-election not far away from Glasgow Hillhead. Is it not true what they were saying, what those pundits were saying, that the Social Democrats' job only really just begins now?
Yes, but you were putting to those pundits what would be their reaction if we'd lost Hillhead. And you're now putting to me what is the reaction if we won Hillhead.
No, it's just an insubstantial thing. I mean, Mrs. Williams is quoted as saying, she may deny it, but is quoted as saying, in the presence of a reporter of the Washington Post, that it has been a flash in the pan, that this is not substantial ground.
No, I quite agree. I don't think any of us felt that we could keep 50.5% at one poll and 40%. Those were ridiculously high levels, and we were bound to slump. What people were saying a month ago, though, was that we were on the slide downhill, and that this meant that we wouldn't win Hillhead. And even 10 days ago, on the streets of Glasgow, I must say I got very worried. And then we suddenly began to pull it back. And I think myself that if we do win Hillhead, as you're all saying we're going to, and I hope you're right, I won't count it until we have, but if we do, it's a tremendous victory. Firstly, it means that we have Roy Jenkins back. We desperately need him, and I must say I think Parliament and the country needs him. He was, I think, by common consent, the best post-war Chancellor of the Exchequer, certainly one of the best. He did a great deal to rescue the economy from the mess it was in 1967. And we need that sort of experience within our own party, and I think Parliament needs to hear, because there is an alternative to Mrs. Thatcher. There is a way of reducing unemployment. There is a way of safely reflating the economy. And I think that would be tremendous help. It will give credibility to our alliance, and I think myself it will mean now that we have got a figure who can win the support of Liberals and Social Democrats, who will look a potential Prime Minister between now and the next election. I think that's very important for us.
Mr. Benn, what do you think this will do to Mr. Foote and to his reputation as a leader?
Well, I must say to win Hillhead would have been astonishing. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I would like to make a couple of points, if I may. First of all, I don't regard the Social Democrats as a centre party. In an odd way, they're a hard right party. Mrs. Thatcher is an old Manchester school liberal who believes in reducing government and letting market forces control things. The Social Democrats are very authoritarian. I mean, if you take a simple issue about centralisation, Roy Jenkins was passionately opposed to devolution when we had our Chequers meeting in the Cabinet. He's always wanted a federal Europe. He wants a statutory pay policy, which I might add brought down 3 governments, brought down us in 70, brought down Ted Heath in 74 and brought down Jim Callaghan in 79. I think what we're seeing really is a hard right party being born in Britain, which is an alternative to the Conservatives. And my own opinion is that a lot of Liberals are going to vote Labour now because without the Social Democrats in the Labour Party is a lot more attractive to the Liberals on defence, and a lot of Conservatives will vote Labour because of the common market. And my own opinion is that Michael Foote will go forward. I think we shall win the next election. We shall certainly be the largest party. And if the results that we've been forecasting come out, it'll be at worst like February 1974, and at best there will be a Labour majority. And I really think it's going to happen, because remember this, Alice, I just finished. It's all this programme has been about Roy Jenkins, his age, his distinction. People at home watching this programme want to know when they're going to get a job, when we're going to get homes, because we've got the lowest house building programme since 31, when we're going to rebuild the health service, provide proper education and dignity in retirement. And I honestly don't think people watching this programme are remotely interested in what happens to the individuals. The media build it up, but what they want to know is what are the prospects for themselves and their families, notably on peace. And I think the peace issue is going to be a dominant one, and on this there's no doubt whatever. It's Labour for a non-nuclear strategy, and the Conservatives and SDP and Liberals for a nuclear defence policy.
Now, you said you would go into any alliance with the SDP, say, if it were a draw. You have said that you wouldn't join any coalition with the SDP or anything like that.
Michael Foote said the same. I think if we are the largest party, and that's looking at the low side of the prospects after the next election, we would form a government. And if the SDP tried to bring us down, which they might if they had the balance of power, I think you'd have a second election, rather like 66 following 64, and I think that will bury the SDP. I do not believe that a party made up of people who have betrayed their own lifelong faith actually has got credibility. And if I were a Liberal, I would be pretty fed up that in the next election I'm only going to be allowed to fight half the seats, and I'm dressed up in uniform to put a lot of SDP members of Parliament back into Parliament. So I personally, we better wait for the results, but I personally think the SDP has passed its peak. I think it's will turn out not to be what it was made out to be. That's my honest conviction.
Mr. Pryor, would you go into an alliance with the SDP?
I don't think it's going to be necessary to go into an alliance with anyone. I'm absolutely confident we're going to win the next election.
Well, having said that, you both said that now, but get back to the realities. At the moment, it looks as if there are 3 major forces in British politics for the first time since the war.
I think it's difficult at this stage to say that there are 3 major forces.
Yes,
it looks much more like it than perhaps before, but I think probably I've heard that same sort of thing said on programmes when Liberals were winning seats like Sutton and Cheam and so on a number of years ago. So I'm not prepared to talk about the future in that way. I must say that the more I hear of Tony Benn and the more I'm certain that people see Tony Benn on this programme, the more frightened I am about the prospects for the Labour government. And I'll tell you the one thing that worries me about that. I mean, I don't believe that a Labour government could possibly get in with those policies anyhow, so I suppose I ought to be thankful that Tony is taking the line that he is. But what does worry me a bit, and that is that there may be some Conservatives who think that the Social Democrats is an easy way out for them and that they can't do any damage by voting Social Democrat. What we are finding is, that, particularly in the south of England, that the Social Democrats are taking more votes from us and have been taking more votes from us than they have the Labour Party, because the Labour Party has practically ceased to exist in the south of England anyhow. And that, I think, might let Tony Benn in with his policies. And quite honestly, if Tony Benn and his policies got in, as it were, by default, then I think that this country really would be in very grave trouble indeed. We've heard tonight the sort of policies that he stands for, pulling Britain out of the common market, a peace policy, which presumably means a total disarmament policy, at a time when the Russians are building one new SS-20 every week and pointing it at this country. Are we really going to get ourselves into that position? And, of course, it seems incredible to me that Tony Benn can talk so glibly about the levels, the very serious levels of unemployment, when his party, despite all that he said when he was in government, managed to add about 1 million to the numbers of unemployed. So whatever the difficulties are, it doesn't seem to me that we're going to get out of them through the socialist way. And what worries me is we might get a socialist government at any time by default.
Well, we'll come
You're
back.
agreeing with me, Jim, that a Labour government next time is likely, and I accept that. I think that's a perfectly fair comment. I think that's absolutely right.
I think the more they see of you, Tony, the less chance there is of a Labour
I think you're really
government.
saying something different, actually. You're saying that I was right, and I think I am. I think Ted Heath, Roy Jenkins and David Steele are part of the same bunch, and they'll split each other's vote. But still, anyway...
We'll come back and have a word about who's right. At Hillhead, there's been a confabulation around the top desk. Colin, what's the verdict?
Well, in fact, Alastair, it looks as though the declaration is just about to happen. They've moved the tables so that they can actually move other tables to let members of the press in that Peter referred to earlier, the members of the press from Fleet Street, Scotland, internationally, and they're coming in for the photocall. The declaration is, I would think, imminent from the position where I am now. It's a very tense atmosphere here because although we're quite sure that it looks as though the SDP's done well and they win, there's still a question of votes, lost deposits and so on.
You think the lost deposit is a possibility, Colin, for the SNP still, do you?
For the SNP?
The SNP, sorry.
To win the seat?
No, for the SNP, the Nationalists, to lose their deposit.
Yes, I think that's still a possibility, Alistair. I was talking to one or two Nationalists only about 5 or 6 minutes ago, and they were talking about the possibility of lost deposit. It was at that point still early days for them to make that sort of decision, but who can say? It looks as though it would happen. If it did happen, this would be the second time in this seat succession, because in 79 he had 10.1% as nationalist candidate, and it would be bad news for the National Party, who are now, of course, fighting on independent Scotland or nothing. They've moved away from devolution, although Labour and the SDP Liberal Alliance have a devolutionary plan.
We're not going to go away from you, Colin. I'd just like to put that point to Mr. Stewart, though. Colin MacKay is saying, Mr. Stewart, you may have lost your deposit for the second time running because you're going for a wholly independent Scotland.
No, I don't accept that. I think it's just in the nature of this particular constituency. And as far as devolution, a Labour representative said the other day the Labour attachment, the Labour commitment to devolution is consistent. We've backed it for 100 years. And Roy Jenkins' immediate conversion, a man who opposed it in the cabinet, was one of the most cynical movements that I've ever seen in politics in my time. And in fact, the SDP has never taken a resolution in favour of devolution.
Well, I think we're very close to the result now. Back to you, Colin.
Well, Alistair, here in Glasgow, it looks as though we're just about to get the declaration. There are 8 candidates in this election, to remind you. The 4 first ones are the ones who are, may we say, the smaller parties. It's the last 4, Leslie, Mr. Jenkins himself, Leslie, Malone and Wiseman. So right to the very last moment in this declaration, there is going to be a great deal of excitement to know exactly how the splits of the votes have gone and to compare that with previous elections. And we are now in a position, I see that a Conservative agent shaking hands with Mr. Jenkins on the platform. And there's Mr. Jenkins. Now he's looking fairly relaxed and happy, or at least he was before he turned around. He's smiling serenely, I think. And there on the right is Pastor Jack Glass, and on the left the Conservative agent. There's Commander William Boakes in the background, just disappearing there. He's wearing the Wellington boots that he's worn for the last 24 by-elections. The Chief Executive, there's Commander Boakes again, as I say, a doughty performer, the man standing for public safety, democratic monarchist and white resident, who appeared twice in the by-election, and he's here again today.
I see, Colin, Mr. Jenkins has got a sprig of white heather.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, here is the declaration.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the result of the Glasgow Hillhead constituency parliamentary election. The votes cast for each candidate at the election was as follows: Boakes William George, Public Safety Democratic Monarchist White Resident, 5. Carlaw Nicolette Ann, candidate for Glasgow Ecology Party, 178. Glass Jack, pastor, Protestant Crusade Against Papal Visit, 388. Jenkins Roy Harold, Social Democratic Party, 282. Jenkins the Right Honourable Roy Harris, Social Democrat Liberal Alliance candidate, 10,106. Leslie George, Scottish National Party, SNP, 3416. Malone Gerald, the Conservative candidate, 8068. Wiseman David Paul, the Labour Party candidate, 7846. And I declare that the member elected to serve in Parliament for the Glasgow Hillhead constituency is the Right Honourable Roy Harris Jenkins.
And that's Mr Jenkins in at Glasgow Hillhead in an astounding by-election victory which presents him as the possible future leader of the Alliance. Good news for them, Tories second, Labour third. And the SNP have lost their deposit with a very high turnout. And here's Mr Jenkins to make his speech.
It falls to me to propose a vote of thanks to the returning officer and his staff for the conduct of this election and for their work in quickly and efficiently counting the votes. I pay full tribute. The result is naturally a great satisfaction to the Social Democratic Party and our Liberal partners in the Alliance. The campaign has not been without its ups and downs, although a constant encouragement has been the close and reflective interest of the electorate in the major issues which have been put before them, reflected by the attendance at meetings, I believe shared by nearly all the major parties. The outcome is a triumph for the New Deal of sense, moderation and hope which we have offered to the people of Hillhead and of Glasgow. The result matches our highest expectations. Hillhead has rejected the Conservatives for the first time since 1918. The Labour Party continues to maintain its record of not gaining a by-election since 1971. The Alliance has polled well in every part of this varied constituency, thus underpinning our claim to represent all sections of the community in Scotland as in the result of the United Kingdom. This is a magnificent first birthday present for the Social Democratic Party. For the Alliance as a whole, it is an inspiration to go forward to the regional and local elections and to the Beaconsfield by-election. Let me conclude by saying that my endeavour will be to represent all the electors of Hillhead with equal respect for those who voted in other directions as well as those who voted for me.
Roy Jenkins' victory speech there being greeted by cheers and boos, magnified many times by the crowd outside the hall who are listening to it all over loudspeakers. We can take a look now, a detailed look at our computer pattern for tonight's result. Roy Jenkins, 10,106. Gerald Malone, Conservative, 8,068. David Wiseman, Labour, 7,846. George Leslie, SNP, 3,416, losing the SNP deposit. Jack Glass, Independent, 388, another lost deposit. Roy Harold Jenkins, the other Roy Jenkins, 282. The second page now. Nicola Carlaw, Ecology Party, 178. And Bill Boakes setting a new British all-comers record for the lowest number of votes polled in a British parliamentary election, I think, within living memory anyway. If you know better, you'll tell us. 5. It was 10, it's now down to 5. The majority 2,038, turnout 76%, swing 16.7% from Conservative to SDP Liberal. And the share of the poll, the one that the pundits will all be wanting to look at and scrutinise. SDP took 33% of the poll here in Hillhead, compared with the 49.1% they took in Crosby. Conservatives took 27% of the poll. Labour took 26%. SNP took 11%, others took 3%. And the change in the share of the poll, compared with the general election in 1979, you can see there that the SDP well up compared with what the Liberals did in 79. The SDP up 18.9% on the Liberal performance in the general election. Conservative down 14.4%. Labour down 8.5%. SNP up 1.2%, some small consolation for them, and others up 2.8%. Now, the big question which is going to be asked is if this Hillhead voting pattern, untypical as it may be, or typical, if it were repeated at a general election tomorrow, what would be the result? And there you are. Labour would have 292 seats at a general election, Conservatives 166, and the SDP Liberal Alliance 152, others 25. The winning post in the House of Commons is 318. So we'd have a hung parliament. The SDP Liberal Alliance, as so many of the commentators which we heard earlier predicted, would hold the balance of power. Endless possibilities there for our panel. Alastair?
Yes, Peter. Ms Jenkins, therefore, has a majority of 2,038, which is almost identical with the Conservative one which he overturned. I think just one footnote to what Peter said. It is quite remarkable this happened in a Scottish seat, where historically people are rather more conservative, both to left and right of the division, and less used to volatile change. Well, Dr. Owen, it is your first birthday as a party. It is a remarkable victory, but the signs seem to be that your advance is slowing down.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I think it's probably now where it's really been over the last 4 to 5 months, with the exception of that very strange and remarkable period from immediately after Croydon and for about a month to 6 weeks after the Crosby result. But it's still, by any standards, fantastic. I mean, when you think of what they were all saying, the old parties, a year ago, that we were a piece of fluff, that we had no substance at all. When you think what Tony Benn was saying only a few minutes ago on this programme, that we were a right-wing party, that we were effectively, somehow the Labour Party was untouched by us. What is obvious from this result is that Roy Jenkins has taken a very substantial part of the Labour vote. The Labour vote has plummeted down, lost 2,520 votes. And I think it's an extraordinary result. The interesting one is this question of projections into a future parliament. I mean, I think one's got to be careful about this. But before one accepts your figuring, I'd like to know on what basis it is. Have you offset for the strong Labour position traditionally in Scotland? How have you allocated the SNP vote? Because in a four-party situation, it's a very different situation from what we'll find ourselves in most of the English seats, with only really 3 major parties fighting. But even so, it is a warning note that because the Labour Party's support is very strongly geographically concentrated, the Social Democrats do have to make certain that we go after that Labour vote in solid areas. We can't just leave that alone either. And I believe we can. A recent poll showed us that we had 32% of trade unionists were supporters of the SDP, whereas the Labour Party only had 35% of trade unionists. And this whole belief in the Labour Party somehow that they still are the only people who the traditional, say, trade union voters supporting is, again, absolute nonsense. I mean, the last election, 40% voted Conservative. And what is happening is the whole shape of British politics is now changing, and I think very much for the better.
I can assure you that our calculations are on the most expert grounds, and indeed the fact that the Labour Party emerges from this, having lost in Hillhead with 292 seats, I think suggests that we have really taken into account much of what you said. Mr. Benn, do you think you could govern on this kind of result?
Well, let me make my comment on the result, because I did give you a benchmark, you remember, at the beginning.
You gave us February. We thought October might be an idea.
I did give you the February one, because that was when the Labour government came to power as a minority. And the Labour vote was higher than in February 74, percentage-wise, though 100 less. What Jenkins has done is to take 4 Tory votes for every 2.5 Labour votes, and that's not surprising when you think there are a lot of Labour people who looked upon him as a Labour person. I think they know a bit differently now. And also, thirdly, that Jenkins's vote tonight was less than the 1979 Labour vote. Now, I think what Jim Pryor says is right, and I want to tell people at home to watch this. I think this means we'll have a Labour government. Now, if we have a Labour government and go on with the policy and have nothing to do with the coalition, then I think if we don't get an overall majority, and this is only the beginning of the fight back, the SDP are on the way down, then we'll have a second election, and the SDP will disappear into their proper political home within the Conservative Party, along with their old buddies like Marsh and Reg Prentice, which is where they really belong in British politics.
Mr. Pryor.
Well, I think it's a much more encouraging result from us than we could have anticipated a few months ago, and therefore I think we have to congratulate Jerry Malone on being a very good candidate indeed. The Labour Party vote has, of course, held up rather better than the Conservative, and I think this does show that the SDP has hit us harder. On the other hand, the SDP vote, and Roy Jenkins himself at Warrington had a swing to him from the Conservatives of 27.5%. He's now down to 16.7%. So there's a very considerable reduction in the swing. And that, I would suggest, was a warning note to the SDP, whose policies, I think, are now coming under more scrutiny, who are very divided on a whole range of policies, from trade unions. I mean, on the Employment Act, Employment Bill, some voted one way, some another, and some didn't vote at all. And there have been some squabbles taking place, and I suspect there are going to be a lot more squabbles now they get down to solid policy. So I don't think the
Well, the victor is just emerging, Mr. Pryor. Forgive me just one moment. Mr. Jenkins is smiling, a vastly relieved man, no doubt, accepting congratulations, and no doubt one who is looking forward to his arrival in the House of Commons just as soon as he can decently manage it. That's the face of the victor at Glasgow Hillhead, Mr. Roy Jenkins, with a swing of 16.7% to the SDP alliance. And there's one of his helpers, the member for Caithness and Sutherland, who's been helping him with the Scottish aspects of his campaign. I think it's fair to say that 2 weeks ago, even Mr. Jenkins, even his closest friend...
I think that would be a good deal better, yes.
Congratulations,
You're
Mr. Jenkins.
always very generous.
What's it feel like to be an MP again?
I think I'll know that better next Tuesday, when I think I shall take my seat on Tuesday. But obviously the result is a great satisfaction, well up to any expectations which we had, and I think shows that the appeal of the Social Democratic Party and the alliance, because it's been very much an alliance campaign with the Social Democrats and the Liberals working in the closest possible cooperation together, this appeal, so far from being confined to England, still less to the southern part of England, is a major appeal in Scotland too. It is indeed notable that of the 3 gains we've had in the past year, one's been in the north of England, one's been in Scotland, and only one's been in the south of England.
Will you now become leader of the SDP?
Well, that's a matter to be determined in the future.
And will you become leader of the alliance, put it another way?
Well, again, it's a matter to be determined in the future, but I think certainly the Social Democratic Party and the alliance will wish to move reasonably rapidly to settling these matters, because we are now, as this election has shown, we are seriously in the business of presenting a third alternative choice, a third choice for the next government of this country.
Dr. Owen says you'll be leader of the alliance in our studio.
Well, that's very nice of him, but let's let all these things work themselves out.
It said you're the only SDP leader David Steele would serve under. Is that true?
Well, that's a matter for David Steele to say, and I think that I've got no comment to make upon that. All I can say is David Steele has given me the most magnificent support here in Hillhead, as has Joe Grimmond, as have many other Liberals, as have my three colleagues in the leadership of the SDP, great numbers of SDP MPs, and great numbers of SDP workers from all over Scotland, and a lot of England too.
Do you want to be Prime Minister?
I want to offer a new choice and a new hope to the people of Britain. If that involves my offering myself for the Prime Ministership, obviously I'm not going to say no.
Mr. Jenkins, thank you very much.
Mr. Stewart, we mustn't neglect you. Your man has actually put on about 350 votes compared with the general election.
Yes, I think he's done very well, although we have lost the deposit, and he certainly didn't deserve that. But obviously, in this type of election where all the pressure has been on, and pointing out that we were starting from a very poor base, people started voting tactically, and that's a luxury that Scotland cannot afford. I think a good deal of Roy Jenkins' success is due to the fact that the people of Scotland are well aware of what the Conservative Party has done to Scotland, dismantling the industrial base and so on. They're also terrified of what the Labour Party is appearing to become, so they're settling for the soft option. And I think it's odd that Roy Jenkins should say they've rejected the Conservative, because whatever they've elected, it's not a Bolshevik. And in fact, the SDP a few months ago sent a circular to 500 big business firms asking them for donations, and going further and saying, kindly let us know how you think the economy should be run. So I think that's marvellous for big business that they should divvy up and then choose what they like off the Christmas tree. So I don't think there's any danger to the capitalist system from the SDP.
I didn't know there was a danger to the capitalist system from you, Mr. Stewart.
No, there isn't. But, I mean, they say they're in business as a radical type of party, and it seems to me that that's a ridiculous claim altogether.
Well, we've heard Dr. Owen saying that he thinks Mr. Jenkins is a natural candidate, and he hopes he will be a candidate for the leadership. We've heard Mr. Jenkins in Hillhead saying that he's most grateful to Mr. Steele and to everybody in the alliance who has helped him in this by-election success. And he didn't indeed put away the crown of the Prime Ministership when it was apparently offered to him by Peter Sissons. Well, let's look ahead now with Mr. David Steele, who's in Westminster, looking ahead to the Beaconsfield by-election, where it will be a Liberal candidate, and looking ahead to the future of the alliance. Mr. Steele, do you think that the natural leader has been elected tonight?
Well, I'm not going to say who should lead the SDP. We've got to wait until they've gone through their democratic processes. All I will say is that I think there's every case now for them speeding up that process and deciding the issue.
Well, Mr. Steele, it's said that you once discouraged Mr. Jenkins from joining the Liberal Party. Are you happy at that decision?
I'm very happy with the decision of the people of Hillhead to elect him as their MP. I think he fought a remarkable campaign, and I think his return to the House of Commons is to the great benefit of us all, but particularly, of course, those of us in the alliance.
In the light of this, would you accept Mr. Jenkins as the natural leader of the alliance?
I've always said, and I'm glad to repeat it again, that I would willingly serve under any one of the Gang of Four, and I think they are on record as indicating they would serve under me. And all I would say is that you can't expect to make these decisions on late-night television programmes, but I do think that it's in the interest of both parties that we decide that sort of thing calmly over the next few weeks.
But this is a great change in the relationship, isn't it, between you and your allies?
Not at all. It's a strengthening of our relationship, and I think that we go forward very strongly now into the local elections and the Beaconsfield by-election, and we go on now to construct what must be an alternative government, because the great significance, I think, of Hillhead, apart from Roy's outstanding victory is the fact that this is a disaster for the Labour opposition. The Tory government can shrug it off and say, well, we wouldn't expect to hold a seat with a 2,000 majority in mid-term unpopularity. But for the official opposition, not only to fail to win the seat but to come third is a major setback. And we have got now in our alliance to form the alternative government to this present disaster and be ready to offer it firmly as a government at the next election.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steele. Quick word now, Mr. Benn, your final thoughts.
One thing we should record this programme as you having made the remark of the year that when 2 Social Democratic MPs have been elected to Parliament, that makes them a third force in British politics. I think the second thing I would say is that all these people who sit as SDP MPs should now resign their seats at once. They have no right to be there at all, and they should expose themselves to the electorate.
Well, Mr. Bruce Douglas Bann is going to do that.
Well,
he said he will fight
I don't know, is he a
June
member? I can't remember. Is he a member of the
yes,
SDP?
He is. Mm-hmm.
The third thing is I would say to people at home, this does mean we shall have a Labour government within 2 years, because the right wing in Britain is divided between the SDP and the Tories, and we shall have a Labour government, and we shall do the things we said we'd do. And therefore, Mr. David Wiseman and all the people in Hillhead have done a fine job for Labour in pointing the way to a Labour government within a couple of years.
And Mr. Pryor?
Well, I think that it shows that the Labour Party have kept up their dismal record of never being able to win by-elections, even when they're in opposition. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we've always said we require 2 terms in government to turn this country round, and I think we're now going to get 2 terms. I am more confident after tonight. I think we've pulled back a lot of lost ground, and I think the more we see of Mr. Benn on television, the more certain I am that people are going to be frightened of ever voting socialist, and thank heavens for that.
Well, thank you all very much. Hope to see you all soon on television again. Good night. Thank you.